Sometimes, the worst decisions are made in silence. Germany, spring of 1945. The war was ending, but inside a small farmhouse on the edge of a ruined town, something quieter, and far more personal, was unfolding. The air smelled faintly of burnt wood carried in from miles away, mixed with the stale scent of flour that hadn't been touched in weeks. A wooden table stood in the center of the room, worn smooth by years of use, now reduced to holding a single object that did not belong, a polished American wristwatch, its metal catching what little light slipped through the cracked window. It ticked steadily, indifferent to everything around it. Across from the table stood Elena Fisher, 21 years old, her hands resting loosely at her sides, her posture straight but not rigid. She wasn't trembling. She wasn't crying. She was simply still. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a way that suggested habit, not care, and her pale blue eyes were fixed somewhere beyond the wall, as if the room itself had already disappeared for her. Behind her, her mother shifted her weight from one foot to the other, the sound of worn shoes scraping lightly against the wooden floor. She had aged in months what should have taken years. Hunger had a way of doing that. Outside, the distant rumble of military trucks rolled along the dirt road, a reminder that control had changed hands, but not conditions. Not really. The Americans had arrived weeks ago. They brought order. They brought rules. They brought food, sometimes. But they also brought a new kind of uncertainty, one that didn't announce itself with explosions, but with quiet negotiations behind closed doors. The woman stepped forward, her hand moving toward Elena's arm, not gently, but not forcefully either, just enough to guide her closer to the table. The watch remained there, its ticking louder now in the silence, marking time in a room where time had already lost its meaning. No one said the words out loud. They didn't need to. The meaning sat between them, heavy and understood. A trait, not written, not spoken, but real. Elena didn't look at the watch. She didn't look at her mother. She turned her head slightly, just enough to see the window, where sunlight filtered through broken glass and dust hung in the air like something suspended between moments. For a brief second, everything felt paused. Then came the sound of boots outside. Firm, measured, not hurried. The kind of steps that belonged to someone who knew exactly where they were going and expected the world to adjust accordingly. The door opened without hesitation. Captain William Carter stepped inside, his uniform clean despite the long days, his presence filling the room not with noise, but with certainty. He stopped just inside the doorway, his eyes moving once across the space, the table, the watch, the woman, the girl. He had seen hunger before. He had seen desperation. But this was different. This was deliberate. The ticking continued. 1 second, then another. Carter didn't speak right away. He didn't step closer. He simply stood there, observing, as if waiting for something invisible to reveal itself. Elena finally shifted her gaze, not toward him, but toward the floor, just for a moment. Then she lifted her eyes again, calm, steady, unchanged. The room held its breath. And for the first time since the war had ended, something unfamiliar entered the space. Not fear, not desperation, but hesitation. Captain William Carter let the silence stretch just a moment longer, long enough for the ticking watch to become the loudest thing in the room, long enough for the meaning behind the scene to settle into something undeniable. Then he stepped forward slowly, each movement controlled, deliberate, as if he understood that anything too sudden would break whatever fragile balance was holding everything together, his eyes never leaving the girl, not once, not even when the woman beside her shifted nervously and tried to speak. "Captain, we thought." But he raised a hand, not sharply, not as a command, just enough to stop the words before they formed, and the room fell back into that same quiet, heavier now, more defined. He moved closer to the table, stopping just beside it, close enough to see the fine scratches on the surface of the watch, close enough to hear the faint mechanical rhythm marking seconds that no one could get. Back, he looked at it for a brief moment, then back at her. Elena did not move, did not lower her eyes this time. She met his gaze with something that was not defiance and not fear, something steadier, something harder to define. And for the first time since entering the room, Carter's expression shifted, not visibly to anyone else, but enough that the air changed, just slightly, as if the room itself noticed. He spoke then, his voice low, even. carrying none of the authority he could have used. "Did you agree to this?" The words hung there, simple, direct, cutting through everything else that had been left unsaid. The woman inhaled sharply behind Elena, but Elena did not look back. She did not hesitate, not even for a second. "No." The word came out clear, steady, almost quiet enough to disappear, but it did not. It stayed. It settled. It changed the shape of the room entirely. Carter held her gaze for a moment longer, measuring something that could not be written in reports or orders, something that had nothing to do with war or duty. Then he exhaled slowly, not heavily, just enough to release whatever decision had already been made in his mind. His hand reached out toward the watch, not to take it, but to turn it slightly on the table, aligning it with the edge as if restoring some small sense of order. Then he stepped back, just one step, creating space where there had been none. "This is not how things work," he said, not to her, not even to the mother, but to the room itself, to the situation. His voice remained calm, but there was something underneath it now, something firm, something that did not invite argument. The woman tried again, her voice thinner this time. "We have nothing left. We thought if we—" He shook his head once, not in frustration, but in certainty. "You do not owe me anything," he said. Then after a brief pause, he added, "No one does." The words did not rise, did not fall. They simply existed, and in that moment, they carried more weight than any order he could have given. He turned slightly toward the door, then stopped, as if remembering something, and looked back at Elena, not at her situation, not at her condition, but at her as a person, whole and unchanged by what had just nearly happened. "You can go," he said. The sentence simple, almost ordinary, but it landed with a kind of finality that made everything before it feel distant, unreal. Elena did not move immediately, not because she did not understand, but because the moment itself needed to settle, needed to be believed. The ticking of the watch continued, steady, unchanged, but everything else had shifted, and for the first time since she had been led into that room, the door was no longer just an exit, it was a choice. Elena moved first with a single step that made no sound against the worn wooden floor, as if even her footsteps had learned to stay quiet in a world that punished noise. She did not rush, did not look back at her mother, did not look at the watch. She simply walked toward the door that now stood open behind Captain Carter. And for a moment, as she passed him, there was a brief shift in the air, something unspoken, something that did not need acknowledgement. He did not turn to follow her, but he was aware of her presence the entire time, the calm in her movement, the absence of panic, the absence of gratitude, and that absence said more than anything else could have. She stepped outside into the pale afternoon light, where the sky stretched wide and empty above the broken rooftops. The wind carried dust across the yard in slow drifting lines, and for the first time in days, she paused, not because she had nowhere to go, but because she had been given something unfamiliar, something that did not come with conditions. Behind her, inside the house, the silence did not dissolve. It deepened. Her mother remained standing near the table, her hand still slightly extended, as if the moment had frozen her in place. She looked at the watch, then at Captain Carter, searching for something to say that would restore control, restore logic, restore the desperate calculation that had led her to this point. But there were no words that fit anymore. Carter walked toward the table again, slower. This time, not as a man entering a situation, but as someone finishing it. He picked up the watch, weighing it lightly in his hand for a second, before placing it back down, not as an exchange, not as payment, just as an object that no longer held power in the room. "You keep it," he said quietly, not as permission, not as generosity, simply as a fact. The woman swallowed, her voice barely holding together. "We did not know what else to do," she said, and for a moment, it was the closest thing to truth that had been spoken in that room besides Elena's single word. Carter did not respond immediately. He looked around the space, the worn furniture, the empty shelves, the thin layer of dust that had settled on everything like a final statement of abandonment. And then he nodded once, not in agreement, but in recognition. "There are other ways," he said, his tone unchanged, steady, grounded. "You will report to the supply station on the East Road tomorrow morning at 8. He continued, already turning toward the door as he spoke. They will issue rations under civilian allocation. The woman blinked, as if the words needed time to translate into something real. No exchange is required, he added, and that was the only emphasis he allowed himself. Outside, Elena had begun walking again, slowly down the dirt path that led away from the house, her figure small against the wide open space, but no longer held in place by it. The wind caught the loose strands of her hair, lifting them slightly before letting them fall again. She did not look back, not because she was afraid, but because there was nothing behind her that needed revisiting. Inside, Carter stepped into the doorway, pausing just long enough to glance once more at the room, at the woman, at the watch ticking steadily on the table. Then he stepped out into the same light, closing the door behind him with a quiet finality that did not echo, did not demand attention, but marked the end of something nonetheless. The distance between him and Elena was already several yards, but he did not call out, did not follow. He simply stood there for a moment, watching as she continued forward, and in that space between them, something settled, not obligation, not connection, but understanding, the kind that does not need to be spoken to remain real. The next morning arrived without ceremony, the kind of morning that did not announce itself but simply replaced the darkness with a pale, uncertain light, and by 7:45, the East Road was already awake with quiet movement. Carts rolling slowly over packed dirt, boots stepping carefully around shallow ruts, and a line had formed outside a low wooden structure marked only by a faded sign that read supply distribution. The paint worn thin by weather and time, Elena stood near the back of the line, her posture the same as it had been the day before, straight, composed, her hands resting loosely at her sides. She had walked nearly 2 miles to get there, the distance measured not in steps but in the absence of hesitation. She had not questioned the instruction, had not doubted it, but she had also not expected anything from it. Around her, people spoke in low voices, fragments of conversation carried through the cool air, numbers, quantities, rumors of shortages, names of towns that no longer existed in the same way. A woman ahead of her adjusted the scarf around her shoulders, pulling it tighter as a light wind moved through the line. No one pushed, no one complained. They simply waited, because waiting had become a kind of survival. Inside the building, crates were stacked in careful rows, flour, canned goods, dried beans, each marked with stenciled letters and measurements in pounds, organized with a precision that felt almost out of place in a country still learning how to stand again. An American soldier stood near the entrance, clipboard in hand, checking names, his expression neutral, his movements efficient. He did not look up often, but when he did, it was with the same steady attention, not searching, not judging, just noting. When Elena reached the front, she gave her name, her voice even, clear. The soldier paused for a brief second, scanning the list, then nodded once. "Fisher," he said, marking something on the paper. "You are on allocation." The words were simple, but they carried a weight that did not match their tone. He stepped aside and gestured toward the interior. "Proceed." She moved forward without reaction, stepping into the space where the air smelled faintly of grain and metal. Another soldier approached, older, his sleeves rolled up, hands marked with dust from the crates. He looked at her briefly, then down at the paper in his hand. "Family of 2, he said, confirming more to himself than to her. Then he turned, lifting a small sack from a nearby crate, the fabric rough but intact. He placed it on the counter, followed by 2 cans, then a smaller wrapped bundle, each movement measured, deliberate. "This will cover 1 week," he added, sliding the items toward her. Elena did not reach for them immediately, not out of hesitation, but because the moment itself required a kind of adjustment, a recalibration of expectation. The man noticed, not her pause exactly, but the stillness around it, and he nodded slightly, as if acknowledging something unspoken. "It is already recorded," he said, his tone unchanged. No exchange. The same words, spoken differently, in a different place, but carrying the same meaning. Elena placed her hands on the sack, feeling the weight of it. Real, solid, not symbolic, not conditional. Just there, she lifted it carefully, adjusting her grip, then gathered the rest, her movements steady, practiced even, though this was new. Outside, the line continued to grow, people stepping forward one by one, each carrying their own version of the same quiet need. Elena stepped out into the morning light again, the sky clearer now. The air warmer by a few degrees. She shifted the weight slightly in her arms and began the walk back, the road stretching ahead in a straight line that did not promise anything beyond itself. And yet, for the first time, it did not feel uncertain. It simply felt open. By the time Elena reached the farmhouse, the sun had climbed higher, casting longer shadows across the dry ground, and the air carried a faint warmth that hinted at a season trying to change despite everything that had come before. She stepped through the doorway without hesitation, the same doorway that had held a different meaning less than a day ago, and inside, nothing had moved. The table remained in the center of the room, the watch still resting where it had been left, its steady ticking unchanged. Her mother stood near the window this time, not at the table, her posture slightly bent, as if the weight she carried had shifted from her hands to somewhere deeper, somewhere less visible. She turned when Elena entered, her eyes moving first to the sack in Elena's arms, then to the cans, then back to her face, searching for something, confirmation, explanation, perhaps even judgment. But Elena offered none. She walked to the table and set the items down carefully, one by one, the soft thud of each object breaking the silence in small, measured beats. The room seemed to listen. Her mother stepped closer, her movements slower now, cautious, as if unsure of her place in this new arrangement. She reached out toward the sack, then stopped just short of touching it, her fingers hovering for a moment before pulling back. "They gave you this," she said, her voice quieter than it had been the day before. Not a question, not quite a statement. Elena nodded once, a simple motion, then began to untie the string at the top of the sack, revealing the coarse flour inside, pale and fine, something that had once been ordinary but now felt rare, almost unfamiliar. Her mother watched, her gaze fixed on the contents as if trying to understand how something so simple could have arrived without cost, without negotiation. "No exchange," Elena said, her voice even, repeating the words as they had been given to her, and the phrase settled into the room with a different weight. This time, not tension, not expectation, but something quieter, something closer to relief, though it did not show on her mother's face immediately. She sat down slowly at the table, her hands resting in her lap, eyes still on the flour. "I thought," she began, then stopped, the sentence unfinished, unnecessary. Elena did not respond. She moved toward the small stove in the corner, checking the remaining wood, adjusting it slightly. Her actions practical, grounded, as if the moment from the day before had already been placed somewhere behind her, not forgotten, but no longer controlling what came next. Outside, a cart rolled past, its wheels creaking softly, the sound carrying through the open window, a reminder that life, in its simplest form, was still continuing. Her mother finally reached for the sack, her hand resting against it, feeling the texture, the weight, real and present. She exhaled slowly, a breath that seemed to release something she had been holding on to without realizing it. "We will make it last," she said, more to herself than to Elena. And this time, there was no calculation in her voice, no hidden cost, just a statement of intention. Elena glanced briefly toward the table, then back to the stove, her movements steady, unchanged. But there was something different now in the space around her, something that had not been there before. Not hope exactly, not yet, but the absence of something else, something heavier, something that had defined every decision until now. And in that absence, even the smallest things began to feel possible. The watch continued to tick on the table, marking time the same way it always had. But for the first time, it no longer seemed to control anything in the room. It was simply there, a reminder of what had almost happened, and of what, quietly, had not. The days that followed did not arrive with sudden change, but with a quiet repetition that slowly reshaped the rhythm of the house. Each morning beginning before the sun had fully risen, the light entering through the cracked window in thin, pale lines that stretched across the floor, and Elena would already be awake, moving through the small space with steady purpose, measuring flour by hand, conserving every ounce as if it were something fragile, something that could disappear if handled without care. Her mother watched these movements at first from a distance, seated at the table where the watch still rested, its ticking softer now, or perhaps simply less noticed. Time had not slowed, but its weight had shifted. It no longer dictated urgency, only passage. On the third morning, the smell of bread filled the room for the first time in months, faint at first, then stronger as the heat from the stove settled into the dough. It was not perfect, the crust uneven, the shape slightly collapsed on one side. But it was real, it existed, and that alone changed the atmosphere of the space more than any words could have. Her mother stood closer that day, her hands resting lightly against the edge of the table, watching as Elena placed the loaf onto a cloth to cool, the steam rising in thin curls, disappearing into the air. "It smells like before," she said quietly, not looking at Elena, but at the bread itself, as if it held something that could not be named directly. Elena did not answer. She simply cut a small piece once it had cooled enough, placing it on the table between them, not offering it, not withholding it, just placing it there, and her mother hesitated only for a second before reaching for it. The motion careful, almost deliberate, as if she understood that this, too, was something new, something unconnected to what had come before. Outside, the road remained active, carts passing, voices occasionally drifting in through the open window, but inside, the space had begun to hold a different kind of silence, not empty, not tense, but full in a way that did not require explanation. Later that afternoon, a knock came at the door, light, measured, not urgent. Elena paused where she stood, then moved toward it, opening it just enough to see the figure on the other side. An American soldier, younger than Captain Carter, his uniform slightly worn at the sleeves, his expression neutral but not distant. He held a clipboard in one hand. "Fisher residence," he said, more as confirmation than question. Elena nodded once, and he glanced down at the paper briefly before continuing. "Captain Carter has extended your allocation for the next 2 weeks," he said, his tone steady, professional. "You will not need to report tomorrow." The words were delivered without emphasis, but they carried a quiet continuation of something that had already begun. Elena listened, her expression unchanged, then nodded again. "Understood," she replied, her voice even. The soldier made a small mark on his paper, then looked up for a brief second, as if considering something, but whatever thought had crossed his mind did not remain. He simply nodded once and stepped back, turning toward the road without further comment. Elena closed the door. Gently, the sound soft, controlled, and when she turned back into the room, her mother was watching her, not with confusion this time, not with calculation, but with something closer to recognition, not of the situation, but of Elena herself, as if seeing her clearly for the first time in a long while. Neither of them spoke. They did not need to. The meaning had already settled, and in that quiet, something continued to take shape, not announced, not forced, but present, steady, like the ticking of the watch that still marked each second, no longer as a measure of loss, but simply as time moving forward. The routine settled deeper with each passing day, not in a way that announced stability, but in the absence of disruption, and by the end of the first week, the farmhouse no longer felt like a place waiting for something to happen. It had become a place where things were already quietly happening. Elena arose each morning before the light reached the far wall, her movements precise, consistent, the kind of rhythm that did not require thought, only presence. She measured flour carefully, always. The same portions, always accounting for what remained, never taking more than what the next day could afford. Her mother began to move earlier as well, not watching from the table anymore, but standing beside her, sometimes reaching for a utensil before Elena did, sometimes adjusting the fire without being asked. Their movements did not overlap, they aligned, as if something unspoken had found its place between them. The bread improved, slightly more even, the crust holding its shape, the center softer, and with each small change, the room responded, the air warmer, the silence less heavy. The watch remained on the table, still ticking, still marking time in the same steady rhythm. But it had lost its presence, no longer the center of attention, just another object in the room, one that no longer held meaning beyond itself. One afternoon, as the light shifted toward a softer tone and the shadows lengthened across the floor, Elena stepped outside with a small bucket, the well behind the house still functional despite everything. She lowered the rope slowly, feeling the weight change as the bucket met water. then lifted it back up with steady effort, the motion familiar, grounding. As she turned to carry it back, she noticed a figure standing near the edge of the road, not close enough to intrude, but not distant either. Captain Carter stood there, his posture the same as before, composed, observant. He had not approached the house, had not called out. He simply stood, watching the space as one might observe something already understood. Elena paused for a brief moment, not out of uncertainty, but acknowledgement, then continued walking, passing him at a distance of several feet, the bucket steady in her hands, the water inside barely shifting. Carter did not speak immediately. He waited until she had nearly reached the door before saying, "The allocation is sufficient," his voice even, carrying just enough to reach her without effort. Elena stopped, turned slightly, just enough to face him. "Yes," she replied, her tone unchanged. There was a pause, not awkward, not tense, simply present. Carter nodded once, his gaze moving briefly toward the house, then back to her. "If there are changes, you report them," he said, the statement structured like an order, but delivered without force. Elena held his gaze for a moment, then nodded. "Understood," she said, and that was enough. Carter did not step closer, did not extend the conversation. He turned slightly, his attention already shifting back toward the road, as if his presence there had never been meant to last. Elena watched him for a brief second, then turned back toward the house, stepping inside and closing the door with the same quiet control she always used. Inside, her mother glanced up from the table, her expression questioning without words. Elena set the bucket down near the stove, the sound soft against the floor. "He came to check," she said simply. Her mother nodded slowly, absorbing the meaning without pressing further, and in that moment, the exchange carried no weight of obligation, no hidden expectation. It existed as something else entirely, something that did not need to be defined to be understood. Outside, the road remained open, the world still uncertain, beyond its edges. But inside the farmhouse, something had already taken hold, something steady, something that did not depend on who stood outside the door, but on what remained within it. By the second week, the change was no longer something that could be traced to a single moment. It had spread quietly through the small details of daily life, settling into places that had once held tension, replacing it with something steadier, something that did not demand attention to be felt. The mornings began the same way, but they no longer carried the same weight. The act of waking was no longer tied to uncertainty. It was simply the start of another day. Elena moved through the house with the same measured rhythm, but now there was a subtle shift in how she occupied the space, less like someone passing through and more like someone who belonged within it. Her mother followed this change slowly, not by imitation, but by recognition. She began to speak more, not in long conversations, but in small observations, the kind that filled silence without breaking it. "The flower is lasting longer than I expected," she said one morning, her hands resting on the table, her voice calm. Elena nodded slightly, adjusting the portion she was measuring. "We use less now," she replied, simple, direct, and the statement held more than its words. It reflected control, intention, something that had been missing before. Outside, the road continued its quiet flow of movement, but occasionally, new sounds entered the space, distant voices, unfamiliar tones, the presence of more soldiers passing through. The war had ended, but its aftermath was still moving, still settling. One afternoon, a group of children appeared near the edge of the property, their clothes worn, their movements cautious but curious. They did not approach the house directly. Instead, they lingered near the well, watching, waiting. Elena noticed them from the doorway, her expression unchanged, but her attention steady. She stepped outside, carrying a small piece of bread wrapped in cloth, her steps slow, deliberate, not approaching too quickly, not retreating either. The children shifted slightly, unsure, but did not run. She stopped a few feet away and placed the cloth on the edge of the well, then stepped back, creating space, the gesture simple, unspoken. One of the older children stepped forward after a moment, glancing briefly at her before reaching for the cloth, unwrapping it carefully. The others gathered closer, their movements cautious but eager. Elena watched for a brief second, then turned and walked back toward the house without waiting for a reaction. Inside, her mother stood near the window. Having seen everything, her expression different now, not questioning, not surprised, but thoughtful, as if understanding something she had not before. "You gave it away," she said quietly, not as criticism, not even as concern, just as a fact. Elena paused near the table, her hand resting lightly against the surface, the watch still there, still ticking. "We have enough," she said, her voice steady. And the words carried a quiet certainty that did not need to be defended. Her mother nodded, slowly, absorbing the meaning, not just of the action, but of what it represented. Outside, the children's voices rose slightly, softer now, less guarded, the sound drifting in through the open window, blending with the steady rhythm of the watch. And for a moment, the room held both sounds at once, time and life, moving forward together, without conflict, without urgency, just continuing, as if that had always been the way it was meant to be. By the third week, the farmhouse no longer felt like a place shaped by what had been taken from it, but by what had quietly returned, not all at once, not in grand gestures, but in small, steady layers that built upon each other without announcement. The mornings carried a different light now, warmer, fuller, stretching deeper into the room as if the space itself had opened to receive it. Elena stood by the window one early morning, her hands resting loosely against the wooden frame, watching. As the road beyond the house came slowly into view, the outlines of passing figures becoming clearer with each passing minute, she had begun to recognize patterns: the same cart at the same hour, the same man walking with measured steps, the same distant voices, rising and falling with the rhythm of daily life. It was not stability in the way it had once been understood, but it was something close enough to be trusted. Behind her, her mother moved through the room with a quiet confidence that had not been there before, her steps no longer hesitant, her hands no longer searching for something to hold on to. She had found her place again, not by reclaiming what was lost, but by accepting what remained. The table still stood in the center, the watch still, resting upon it, its ticking unchanged, but its meaning transformed. It no longer marked a moment of desperation. It marked continuity, time moving forward without asking permission. Later that day, Elena stepped outside once more, the air carrying a faint hint of warmth that spoke of a season turning. She walked toward the well, her movements steady, familiar, and as she lowered the bucket, she heard footsteps approaching along the road. Not hurried, not uncertain, she did not turn immediately. She finished the motion, lifting the bucket with the same controlled effort. Then she turned. Captain Carter stood a short distance away, his presence as composed as ever, but there was something different in the way he stood now, less like someone observing and more like someone acknowledging. He did not step closer, did not break the distance that had always remained between them. "The reports are consistent," he said, his voice calm. "Neutral. There have been no issues." Elena held the bucket steady in her hands, the water inside reflecting the pale sky above. "There are none," she replied, her tone unchanged, the exchange simple, direct, but beneath it, something had settled, something that did not need to be spoken. Carter nodded once, his gaze shifting briefly toward the house, then back to her. "Good," he said, and for a moment, neither of them moved. The space between them held no tension, no expectation, only a quiet understanding that had formed without intention, without design, just through a series of choices that had led them here. He turned then, his attention returning to the road, the same road that carried everything forward without pause. Elena watched him for a brief second, then shifted her grip on the bucket and began walking back toward the house, her steps steady, unchanged. As she reached the doorway, she paused, not out of uncertainty, but awareness, the kind that comes when something has ended without needing to be marked. She stepped inside, the room welcoming her with its familiar stillness. Her mother glanced up, meeting her eyes for a brief moment, and in that glance, everything that needed to be understood was already there. Elena set the bucket down near the stove, the sound soft, controlled, and as she moved toward the table, her hand brushed lightly against the surface near the watch, not stopping, not acknowledging it directly, just passing by. And in that simple motion, the final shift completed itself. Nothing dramatic, nothing spoken, just a quiet continuation, the kind that does not demand attention, but defines everything that follows. And somewhere beyond the walls of the house, the world continued to rebuild itself, piece by piece, just as they had, without noise, without spectacle, simply by choosing, again and again, to remain human.